Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. While more connection points can create more security soft spots for industrial enterprise, it's no surprise that hackers would generally prefer to log in as opposed to break in. It's rumored that credential theft via phishing schemes is how attackers were able to infiltrate Colonial Pipeline. And as the industrial sector has added more technology, perhaps the greatest overall vulnerability is in the login process. Workers using simple passwords that can be guessed by computerized algorithms, a lack of double-factor authentication systems and similar protocols, as well as an influx of phishing schemes that can plant credential harvesting malware on computers and mobile devices have made infiltration easier than ever before. Regardless of how much software is utilized and automation technology is integrated, the greatest asset of any manufacturing enterprise will always be its people. This means cybersecurity plans must incorporate a focus on why login protocols and best practices are so important. It also means enforcing a number of little things that can have a huge impact on preventing access to the wrong people. Our guest for today's episode will offer some first-hand expertise on the hows and whys of access abuse. But before we talk to him, we're excited to announce that Security Breach is being sponsored by Pentera. For more information on their cybersecurity solutions, you can go to pentera.io. It's now my pleasure to introduce Venkat Thummisi, CTO and founder of Inside Out Defense, to Security Breach. Venkat, thanks so much for joining us today on Security Breach. Really appreciate you taking the time. We're going to talk about a lot of things that I think everybody is familiar with, but one of the things I always like to do with our guests is have them put some of this subject matter, some of these critical issues, sort of in their own words. So the first thing we're going to talk about is privileged access abuse. Maybe from your perspective, you can tell us how you would define this and how it presents itself so prominently in the industrial sector.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be talking to you, and thanks for the opportunity to be talking about one of the most pressing challenges that we are facing, and we are going to be addressing, in the coming days and months. So, privileged access abuse is primarily about what the users do or get to do beyond their initial authentication and authorization, right? So the way it works is users get onboarded through one of the onboarding systems, which could be, like your Active Directory or Okta or SailPoint or any other systems. And they get what we call as birthright provisioning, right? So they get the initial privileges and the entitlements to operate as a user within the organization. But what happens after that is what it makes it interesting, because given our daily roles of playing or wearing different hats for different activities, we need more entitlements, more privileges. And over a period of time, we would users incrementally acquire more number of privileges than to the liking of an organization. And now the challenge here is that those privileges could be abused by a malicious insider, or could be an external threat actor who could potentially compromise those identities, either them being sitting ducks for through some of the access vulnerabilities. So we define privileged access abuse as deployment of privileges by users, insiders or external actors, for malicious activities to disrupt organizations.
Yeah. And we've seen this sort of surface in a number of different ways, okay? Whether it be, and you address a lot of them actually in the ways that your software and your services attack this privileged abuse access. So maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the things you've seen specifically to manufacturers in the industrial sector about how this access abuse has presented itself.
Jeff, if you look at the traditional OT sector, manufacturing, industrial, and other industries, right? So they are digital supply, complex digital supply chains where you have a number of outbound and inbound connections, interactions happening. I mean, let's take oil and gas as an example, right? So there is a multitude of inbound and outbound interactions happening through upstream suppliers, downstream suppliers, and so on. Now, the convergence of the traditional OT and IT is what makes it more challenging with respect to how user interactions are handled, right? So a user who gets to access an organization's systems invariably, it could be a federation into many of the other systems that that they would need to operate upon. Now, it could be a function of having more access than one would need, or it could be, more amount of privileges that they would have to access some sensitive data, or it could be even the ability for them to exfiltrate data or sensitive data from the organization. So this takes a multitude of dimensions with respect to what one can do, but it all starts from that initial foundation of how one gets to access organization systems. And that's where inside out defense is very clear about calling every user today as a privileged user.
So how do we get in trouble here? We've heard a lot of different things, whether it's providing too many rights to too many people and they have access to too many different systems. We've heard about situations where a lot of these credentials are still in place even though someone has left the company and been gone for serious amounts of time. It all kind of comes back to either best practices or protocols or people. So when you're looking at the way that the flow can sometimes emanate and create problems within the industrial sector because of these abusing all these access points, what are some of the typical things that you see as terms of the points? And maybe then talk about how do we get past this and how do we solve some of these big problems?
Absolutely. If you look at organizations today, as I mentioned earlier, these are complex digital supply chains, right? And there are a lot of business activity like mergers and acquisitions, as you mentioned, where two different organizations are coming together. So there is not that there is a reconciliation happening with respect to everything secure, that security is concerned, right? So here, even taking that as an example of M&A, we see that organizations have to deal with multiple sources of truth, right, in the sense of identity systems, and which are not necessarily reconciled. And then, we have organizations having a heterogeneous footprint as compared to what we have seen, maybe a couple of decades earlier, right? So today, enterprises are a mixed bag of cloud, on-prem systems, hybrid workloads. I mean, and a mix and match of SaaS and legacy applications. So when you have a heterogeneous mix of such workloads, you have to deal with what we call as managed and unmanaged systems, right? On one hand, users could be federated through an onboarding system, as I mentioned earlier, to different systems. But beyond that, if there are legacy systems that you have to deal with or custom environments that you have to deal with, they're not necessarily something that is federated through your onboarding system. So which leads to where we do not really have a clear view of users' footprint across the organizations, right? Now let's take an example in this scenario, right? So a third party who has access to an organization leaves the organization or is decommissioned. Now, he might be decommissioned, or the user might be decommissioned with respect to the onboarding system is concerned, but might have residual footprint in some applications. And we see this all the time when we talk to our customers, that there are those residual footprints which can be leveraged either by the same user or could become a sitting duck for a potential external compromise.
Absolutely. So you've touched on a couple of things there I want to explore a little bit more. First of all, the visibility. that's a huge problem on the OT side of things, and we'll dive into that in a little bit. But when it comes to login and access, we got these two silos with IT and OT. How do you sort of handle that? Whose responsibility does it fall under? How do we get those two entities working together to address these types of challenges?
Yeah, so the convergence of IT and OT is, does present a lot of challenges, but at the same time, opportunities to for organizations to be seen as one entity. However, easier said than done, right? So, in the process, there is a need for both the systems to kind of, not just align and reconcile from a technology standpoint, but also in terms of the process, in terms of the steps need to be taken in terms of having an initial access hygiene or posture, and then look at what is the art of the possible for external entities to kind of leverage these vulnerabilities, right? Irrespective of the modus operandi of the attackers that we see today, right? It could be malicious, it could be ransomware, it could be data exfiltration, it could be like man in the middle, it could be many other types of business disruption. But irrespective of like what is the modus operandi, it always starts with that access, isn't it, right? So today, that initial access is what gives you the keys to the kingdom in a sense, with respect to the different resources are concerned. So that is where I think there is a lot of granular gating, like with respect to zero trust, but also it is about trust with but verify, right? Just because a user is an admin does not necessarily mean that the user is entitled to carry on any kinds of activities on the target resource, right? So the ability to gate every user and validate that proof of trust behind every activity, is what becomes key to transact business activities today.
Yeah. So I know you've talked about this already in our conversation here, but you brought up an interesting term there in terms of access hygiene. I think that's something we don't think a lot about because we've got stuff like double factor authentication, or people just don't think those logins are, they think they're secure enough the way it is. But when you look at it from a perspective of developing an access hygiene plan as part of your larger cybersecurity plan, maybe you could talk us through what should that look like, or where do you start, or what are maybe some of the big bullet points that would be included in that type of strategy?
Certainly. Access hygiene, starts with the onboarding of a user, right? And again, when I mention a user, it could be a human or a non-human user. It could be an API access as well.
That's a great point.
So today, most of the products or most of the solutions out there in the market primarily focus on ensuring the user is who the user is, with respect to, validation of an identity, right? The focus is more about validation of that user identity with multi-factor authentication and whatnot. But if you look at, the real, challenge is, what happens after that, right? What happens beyond an initial authentication authorization? So some of the things, that organizations should keep in mind is, number one, it could be, zero standing privileges, right? It could be just-in-time privileges. Adopt more of zero trust framework in terms of granular access rather than just handing over the keys to the kingdom, right? The fourth one is, given the technology and the technology complexity and the heterogeneous environments, nature of environments that enterprises have to deal with today, including like third parties. It is about building that context behind every user, right? We need to have the context behind what is the user up to at any given point in time. I mean, what is their footprint? What kind of privileges do they have? Because gone are the days when users privilege was defined by role-based access control, right? So, it is no longer about a one-size-fits-all approach. It is about, that granular level of privileges and entitlements that users need to have at any given point in time. So, I think that hygiene or posture check from an access standpoint starts all the way from understanding the user footprint, building that context, and making sure that the organization's admins or guardians of identities within the organization have a clear view of the users' ability and then their entitlements and their activities at any given point in time.
Well, it makes sense. There's a lot of instances where we say don't get bogged down by the details, but this is one instance where you do. You need to really look at the detailed elements of what that individual needs access to in developing a more customized approach as opposed to a one-size-fits-all.
You're right. You're right. Traditionally, right, if you look at the security landscape and the solutions that have kind of like evolved over a period of time, it was all about making sure that the organization's perimeter was was protected, right? I mean, like there was a lot of fortifying those defenses. Could be endpoint security products and whatnot, right? A lot of focus was around fortifying the fort, if you will, right? The castle, if you will, around the organization. But these days, like access is your, new attack surface. I mean, that is your perimeter. So, from that standpoint, it is instead of focusing on fortifying the defenses. I mean, I'm not saying that it is not needed. Of course, it is needed from a posture, but instead, focusing on who is doing what, who's trying to do what, like what do they have access for, and how are they operating that privilege, like or deploying that privilege to access, the resource becomes a key aspect, because access in itself, is not the problem, Jeff. Here, it's more about, like how is that access deployed to, transact activities within the organization.
Absolutely. And there's a lot that organizations can do internally, one of which is putting up a good defense initially. One of the things that we've seen happen a lot in the industrial sector, especially from a login perspective and access perspective, is a lot of these malware attacks that really focus on credential harvesting. Maybe you could talk a little bit, are you familiar with those, or maybe some of your personal experiences and potentially best practices for defending against them?
Definitely. Credential harvesting is one of the standard ways of going after an organization these days, because of the amount of attacks, known or unknown, that's happening, right? So from a credential harvesting standpoint, there are the pretty major business risks that organizations have to deal with. First off, I mean, you are talking about unauthorized access, right? I mean, like with those compromised identities, you have these unauthorized access, wherein you probably don't know where the user is coming from, but they are presenting the right set of credentials. We have seen this with our customers, wherein machines, not even users, machines are logging in from anonymous sources into organizations with the right credentials. So it suffices to say, I think, it presents a huge consequence for businesses, with respect to their activities. And some of the ways to protect organizations against credential harvesting is about just-in-time access, right? Of course, there are granular gating systems in place today, but just-in-time. I mentioned about zero standing privileges at any given point in time, and I know which basically comes to the fact that there is no need for any users within organizations unless there is they have a valid reason to have users with perpetual, right, perpetual access to systems and resources within organizations. We have even seen customers wherein, and I think this is kind of common to many other organizations who have been there for a while, in the sense that, they have users who have this access kind of, literally, everything within the organization. So that presents a major challenge. So it is about kind of, having an objective view of, who needs what access and why do they even need access.
Yeah. And we've heard a lot of organizations developing sort of a segmentation type of approach too, to help ward off against this type of thing. Yeah, you can get access to this area, but then you need to log in again to get access to another operating system or network. So it seems like those tactics would all fit together pretty well in this type of situation.
Definitely, geofencing is definitely one other approach that some of the tools are taking to help customers with respect to focusing as to what do they have. A case in point is even in API accesses, right? When we have API accesses, the focus is more about presenting those credentials to gain access to resources, but they do present a lot of challenges with respect to how much of an access do they have, right? Is there any shadow resources or that are being created which we are not aware of? I think that micro segmentation, as you mentioned, or geofencing is a key aspect to that.
Interesting. We know all these attacks are a little bit unique depending on the environment, depending on the attacker, but are there any consistencies that you might be able to share in terms of what an access abuse attack looks like, in terms of what are maybe the strategies, tactics, maybe you can kind of walk us through what these could look like?
Yeah, maybe I can provide a couple of examples with respect to what we are hearing from customers to drive home this point, right? The primary areas of abuse have been about data exfiltration, right? Data access abuse, if you will, right? Wherein even sensitive data is being exposed or being kind of exfiltrated to personal drives of users and whatnot. That is one area. The other area is users abusing some of the existing processes within organizations to gain backdoor entry or access to some of the resources, right? And what they do is it's not that somebody gains access and boom, there is a disruption, right? It is there is a lot of strategy behind it. There is users, for example, users gain access to resources that they are unauthorized through a backdoor entry such as group privileges, right? All they have to do is subscribe to specific group privileges, and they have access to many other resources that they should not have. The reason behind this is many a times within organizations, we do what we call as cloning of privileges, right? I mean, we don't create anything new. I mean, it's more of cloning these group subscriptions, and then you have this backdoor entry and to a resource, and they lurk around, right? There is some kind of a reconnaissance lurking around the system, understanding the lay of the land, and then choosing to weaponize at the time of their choosing, right? So these are some of the areas that we see as major areas of problems. Again, this kind of takes its own flavor depending upon the industries, right? So if you look at fintech, like financial services, it is about data, it is about customer data, right? Whereas if you look at pharma, it is about IP theft. And when it comes to like manufacturing, supply chains, and other industries, it is about exfiltration of data, unauthorized access for business disruption, especially when you're looking at some of these mission critical industrial systems out there, which are prone to some of these attacks because of the fact that the OT and IT infrastructure are still catching up as far as convergence is concerned.
It's interesting. So do you see a lot more issues emanating from individuals inside the organization as opposed to entities outside trying to hack in?
Great question. Great question, actually, because if you look at the data, right, data suggests that it is more of external attacks, which are from a percentage standpoint. But that does not kind of leave alone the malicious insiders, which is like a small percentage, right? But the insiders need not be malicious insiders, but actually aid towards an external attack. Yeah. Because of the vulnerabilities, because of like let's say inactivity, right? Privileged users being inactive for extended periods of time, or it could be weak passwords. It could be like which could be compromised through brute force attacks, right? So there are a lot of things that users should be aware of, or like from an organization's security mandate perspective, to protect themselves against some of these access vulnerabilities. We have even seen, especially in some of the manufacturing customers, we have seen instances where there are shared user accounts, because like more than one user has to have access to certain systems, so they use managed users and managed credentials. So I think there is a lot that can be done from an internal hygiene perspective to prevent against external attacks on such instances.
Yeah, I mean, we see that with a lot of small organizations. They think they can share the wealth a little bit and make sure everybody's getting visibility into these systems, and it does open them up to a lot of problems. One of the things we're seeing a lot more of too, and this is really frightening, is on the dark web. Literally hundreds of millions, and I did say that, that's what I meant to say, hundreds of millions of credentials for logging into organizations' sensitive systems, basically up for sale. What is your experience in dealing with some of this, and what can organizations do to at least get some visibility into seeing, hey, am I at risk? Do I have stuff that's some credentials that are actually being sold right now?
That's a great question, and that continues to increase, isn't it? Right? It's kind of evolving non-linearly across industries, irrespective of like how big and small they are. Recently, I was talking to an SMB customer, like an online retail storefront, where they said that some of their coupons were up for sale, like online on the web. So I mean, this takes different forms and shapes. And it is a real problem that organizations are facing. This is which could be a function of like ransomware attacks that that are happening, where data is exposed to the dark web. And especially in ransomware attacks, what we have seen is when an organization is subject to a ransomware attack, like 60% of the time they do, there is a recon attack, right? Because the attackers know that the organization might have taken a tactical remediation approach versus a holistic remediation view. So ways to protect would be that they fortify their defenses with respect to with respect to this access, right? And look at again comes back to that build like building the context. Like easier said than done, but it is in their interest to make sure that they have a view and visibility to what you mentioned earlier with respect to like what are the assets within the organization. And when we talk about organization or the organization perimeter, right, it like it includes third party interactions as well. So it is important to have that context before kind of like framing an approach in terms of a vulnerability check that organizations need to have consistently, right? So we have seen customers having access audit checks like every month or so, but the problem that we have here is that access is a here and now problem, right? Amongst all other security events, if you look at access, it's a here and now problem wherein if you don't detect and mitigate the problem right then and there, I mean, it is just too late. Even a minute late is just too late.
Yeah, it's a great point. So, Venkat, we've talked a lot about the bad guys and the tough stuff that's out there. Let's talk about some of the good guys here a little bit. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about Inside Out Defense and some of the things that you guys are doing.
Sure. Inside Out Defense is a privilege abuse defense solution wherein we detect in real time and remediate in line all the privilege access abuses that we see in organizations, right? And when I say an organization, it is basically protecting against all their cloud workloads. It could be non-cloud, hybrid, or on-prem workloads. SaaS applications could be APIs, could be legacy custom homegrown applications. So it is a holistic or a comprehensive solution to mitigate those privilege access abuses in real time. And the way we do that is by building that context of, and hence the intent that users might display during their activities. It is a SaaS cloud-based solution, but works with most of the workloads that our customers might have.
Interesting. Kind of wrapping things up here, I'd love to get your thoughts on just a couple of sort of broad categories within cybersecurity that we're talking a lot about. You've mentioned both of them. The first one is cloud computing. The industrial sector, there's this mass migration. We had started early on. There were some early adopters that went to the cloud. It's gaining even more steam by smaller to mid-sized enterprises right now. But there's not always a great appreciation for the fact that security is still going to rely on the user, or to at least talk to that cloud provider to make sure there's inherent security measures and the right ones in place. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your experiences, or maybe some advice in terms of going to the cloud and making sure you're staying secure in doing so.
Definitely. Like you said, there is a lot of push towards cloud security and adoption of cloud from organizations, including the OT sector, right? In doing so, there are challenges with respect to customers, in the sense that they need to understand the technology landscape, right? Because one of the things of working in a mixed environment is understanding your landscape and the technology complexity that arises out of it. So even in cloud, right, while has a great set of tools to protect customers from any of these different security vulnerabilities. It is a shared responsibility model, as wherein the security of their workloads is rests upon the customers. So it is it is very important for them to understand what how do they protect their workloads as they transition their environments onto the cloud, and working truly in a heterogeneous environment, right? Yes, that the transition is happening, and it will continue to kind of grow, and add when you add to that other aspects of more and more of remote operations, remote work that's coming in, and this applies to even OT infrastructure as well, where there is a lot of system maintenance, upgrades, patching that happens remotely these days, rather than like a physical physically managing those assets. So organizations need to take a holistic view of this with respect to how do they protect not just in the cloud, but the other aspects of environments, and how do they kind of align with this approach. Because it's like saying this, right? It does not suffice for me to say that I can protect your front door and 9 out of your 10 windows, and then that approach just doesn't work.
Yeah, there's always the back door to take care of as well. Absolutely. Another one, and you mentioned this topic earlier a little bit too, in terms of how it could have malicious intentions or applications. But in terms of artificial intelligence in the cybersecurity realm, you've got some people on one side who are deathly afraid of what this is going to mean and the tool that this can provide the hackers. You've got other folks on the white hat side saying, hey, we can use this AI to better our defenses as well. I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of maybe the role of artificial intelligence and what you see going forward in terms of cybersecurity.
AI and generative AI, I think, is probably like one of the best use cases for them is cybersecurity. Okay. Simply because that here we are talking about volumes, right? And we are talking about volumes. We are talking about alert fatigues that security teams are facing, right? There is going to be more adoption of AI and generative AI in security space, simply because of alleviating those challenges of like dealing with scale. The second aspect that we have as a challenge, Jeff, is historically, right? Historically, we have security teams have been inundated with these alerts and recommendations, right? Um, you know. Dealing with 10 alerts or recommendations versus 10,000, like you say, is a different ball game, irrespective of how many number of like resources that you throw at it. So it is more about understanding two aspects of this changing landscape, which is what we call as autonomous moving target defense, right? So cyber threats are getting more and more sophisticated, right? So there is a need to understand those unknown behaviors, as well as known behaviors of these threats in dealing with it. And that's where AI plays a very important role. The second aspect is uh, there is a need for customers. Customers are asking for a more deterministic solution, wherein you actually tell them what the problem is, and then also show them a way to mitigate that, instead of bombarding them with thousands of alerts, which is not going to solve the problem, because like a manual approach for this humongous problem is not the solution.
No, the alerts definitely can become white noise. So it's important, I think, using a tool like AI to prioritize, sort, address whatever the case may be is a great call. Winding things down here, Venkat. Next 12 to 18 months, this is the sort of the concluding question I always ask everybody on the show. What do you see as some of the bigger issues, challenges, or just trends that are going to be driving industrial cybersecurity?
We already spoke about AI. I think AI and generative AI is going to be definitely a great addition to this to the cyber defenses of organizations through security tooling. We spoke about cloud security. There's going to be more and more adoption of cloud security, and like a decentralized decision making process. Like at the edge, right? With the aid of cloud. The third aspect, which is predominantly that has been under the radar, is about the importance of privilege abuses and detecting them and remediating them in real time. Because like I mentioned earlier, Jeff, the focus primarily so far has been on solutions which look at identity protection. But I think there is much more that needs to be done in terms of recognizing this challenge of privilege access abuse and mitigating them in real time. I think this is going to take center stage with respect to how organizations build and enforce their or basically build an approach or strategy around their security infrastructure.
Thanks, Venkat. And for more information on the work Inside Out Defense does, you can check them out at insideoutdefense.com. Thanks for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Venkat Thummisi, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.